turn, and boom. Okay. Ha, we're back. Click and clack to tap it, brothers. Actually, I'm kidding. So we finished the mollusca. Let's look at the segmented worms. And when we're done with that, by the end of the day, we'll be almost completely done with the Spiralia. And then we've only got one major group to look at, the Ecdysozoa. So yeah, believe it or not, we're actually getting through this. So let's cut over here to there. There's where we were. That's the mimic octopus. So moving on to the segmented worms. The phylum Annelida consists of worms with a big coelom, and in most, there are some that lose this feature, but in most, that coelom is partitioned off into segments. There's a few that secondarily lose them. But if you were to dissect an earthworm, you would see that under the skin, the coelom is divided by these sheets of tissue. You can see looking at the outside that the worm is segmented. It looks like it's kind of made out of rings, kind of like the Michelin Man, I guess. But that segmentation pattern persists on the inside of the worm as well. The whole coelom's divided off by these bulkheads. The polychaeta are mostly marine. There's a few freshwater ones, including one you might see on your excursions through pond water. But most of these live in the ocean. They've typically got lots of bristles on the body. You'll see the bristles called both setae and chaetae, and I've never been sure exactly what the difference is. But polychaeta, poly is many in Greek, so polychaeta means many bristles. The bristles typically go on paddle-like appendages called parapodia. Yes, parapodia are paddle-like appendages that are perfectly peculiar. All right, my alliteration is awesome. Para means beside or similar to. So parapodia means similar to foot, although maybe not quite the same. Sometimes the parapodia may be quite reduced. In other cases, they might be quite big. But the parapodia bear the bristles. And again, most polychaetes are marine. The freshwater ones tend to be small and don't actually look that much like classic marine polychaetes. Most of these you'd have to go to the ocean to see. The big ones that you'd see in freshwater and on land are in a group called the Clitellata. They do have a few setae. If you've ever taken an earthworm and just kind of gently stroked it, you can feel the short bristles that it's got. But I think a typical earthworm might have only 2 or 4 per segment. They're not long, they're not obvious, and there aren't any parapodia. There's no leg-like appendages on an earthworm. And there's also a thickened section of the body that secretes an egg sac called the clitellum. You've seen this if you've ever gone fishing with worms. There's a head, and then a little ways back of the head, there's a section of the body that's a little bit thicker and a little bit lighter than the rest of the worm. That's the clitellum. If you're not familiar, I'll try to show you in a bit. And we divide the Clitellata into Oligochaeta and Hybridinea. Oligochaeta is earthworms and allies, and Hybridinea is leeches. So I'm not really going to get into polychaete classification. They're usually divided into scalecids and palpatas. Scalecida have sensory palps, don't have sensory palps, and palpata do. Palp, again, is a word for a little flap-like appendage. So sensory flap organs are the palps. But for convenience, these are not good clades, but we talk about polychaetes as being errant or sedentary. Errant ones move. Sedentary ones build permanent tubes and pretty much stay there all the time. So here's an errant polychaete. You could actually, in the San Francisco Bay Area when I was there, these were actually popular as live bait to use fishing in the ocean. Genus Nereus, the clamworms. The head is over at the upper right, and you can see there's a whole bunch of what look like legs. Those are those paddle-like appendages, the parapodia. And Nereus can, in fact, move quite well at some stages of the life cycle. They may swim quite a bit with all those little flaps. They can also crawl quite vigorously. And if you look carefully at the head, down below, you can see the first couple of parapodia. And that second one, the lowest most, has a little bunch of those chaetae coming out of it. And then in the head end, Nereus has pretty well-developed eyes. On the head, you can see antennae, cirri, and tentacles, all different forms of sense organs. And we've seen this word before. The jaws are on an introvert. That's a section of the gut that can be pulled in and turned inside out and retracted, or extended and turned right side out. In this case, it's to trap prey. So Nereus can actually, that top thing with the two things that look like claws on it, that's the jaws. And Nereus can evert that pretty rapidly, grab you with it, or not you personally, but grab a fish or a small invertebrate with it, and then retract those jaws back in. So we've seen that word before, the introvert. And Nereus is predatory. There are some that are very good at this. Eunice aphroditois right here is a burrowing errant polychaete. It's kind of neat that it's iridescent. But you can see that on the head end, it's got this honking big pair of toothed jaws. And these will, these are sit and wait predators. They'll hang out in the sand and wait until a fish gets too close and then come bursting out of the sand and take a hunk out of them. And yeah, this one you have the jaws fully extended, and it's rather frightening. I don't know if you get the name bobbit worm, but back in, what was this, late 80s, Lorena Bobbitt was an abused wife who married to a man named John Wayne Bobbitt. That name always tells you something's up, and he was abusing her. And when she finally just absolutely couldn't take it anymore, she cut his penis off and threw it away. And this was all over the news. And paramedics were actually able to find, and then doctors were able to reattach Bobbitt's severed organ. He actually made a couple of porno films. I really do not recommend you ever see these. They're, never mind. I don't even know what's in them. I've never seen them in my life. But anyway, hence the name bobbit worm, for something that in theory could chop off the marital tackle of an unwary scuba diver. Although in life, they're not quite big enough to do that. And okay, I've said too much. Let's get out of here. If you look at a cross-section through Nereus, in brown and then in yellow, that's the gut. There's blood vessels above and below. Surrounding the gut, all those things that look like cells are actually gametes. There aren't separate ovaries and testes. The egg and sperm cells are just budded off by specialized cells in the lining of the coelom, which means that when it comes time for Nereus to reproduce, they swell up because they're so full of gametes, and they'll actually explode, or they'll rupture to release the gametes. And they tend to do this all in sync. In kind of salmon, you can see 4 bundles of body wall muscles. And then the parapodia are clearly visible. Each one has an upper and a lower lobe, each one supported by a little rod. So there's an endoskeleton here. And then each one has a bundle of those chaetae, those bristles. As I've said, they're almost all marine, but this is one you could conceivably spot in the local freshwater. It's microscopic. The anatomy is very highly reduced. You don't really see parapodia on these guys, but you can see fairly long bristles, especially if you look at the close-up image on the right. This one's called elosoma, and it does turn up in the local pond water often enough that you might spot it one of these days. There you can see the setae on the parapodia very clearly. I actually found one of these overturning rocks on one of my trips down to Baja California, and I thought it was really neat, and I attempted to pick it up, and I'm not going to do that again because those setae break off like tiny porcupine quills, and there's actually some venom on them. Certainly not enough to kill, but enough to irritate your skin pretty badly. There's a reason why this is called the fireworm, Hermodice. And it's just a nice example of what worms can do with those setae. You can see that each parapod has two bundles of them, each one above the other. Nobody messes with these guys. Okay, within the Annelida, there are at least 3, and actually now I think we know there are 4 groups that used to be considered separate phyla, but now that we have more information about them, they actually belong within the polychaeta. These are polychaetes whose anatomy was so modified that we now think that we didn't think they were polychaetes for a very long time. The Polygonophora, that's Greek for beard carriers. They live in tubes, so they're sedentary polychaetes. They've got a crown of tentacles on the head, but in the adults, there is no functioning gut. The gut exists in juveniles, but the midgut picks up bacteria from the outside and loses its connection to the outside world. So the mouth and the anus disappear, and the gut becomes this isolated sac within the body full of symbiotic bacteria. The symbiotic bacteria provide all of the worm's nutrition. That organ is called the trophosome. Trophane is Greek for to feed, so trophosome means the feeding body. And on the head, the cephalic lobe bears a beard that consists of anywhere from a single tentacle to many thousands of them. And until 1964, we actually thought they were deuterostomes, mostly because we'd never collected a complete one. These are extremely long, thin, delicate worms. They all live in the deep ocean. And back in the day, the usual way to collect deep water organisms on the bottom was to make a dredge, this big scoop that you could drag behind your boat, which will bring up sea creatures, but sometimes scrambles them a bit. And until 1964, nobody ever saw the butt end of a Pogonophoran. But it turns out that that butt end has chaetae, and it's segmented, and it looks just like a little annelid. So these are basically annelids where the head has been strung out to take up almost all of the body, and the rest of the body is reduced to a tiny little bit at the back end. So between that and data from DNA that started coming out in the 90s, we now classify these former phylum as a family within the polychaetes. And this is what one of them looks like when you take it out of its tube. You can see the tentacles at the anterior end up there. The very long, narrow body, and then at the very end, you have that little segmented part that looks almost like a rattlesnake rattle. Way back at the very end. That's homologous to the whole body of a typical polychaete. And yeah, by the way, they're dependent on symbiotic bacteria, and they tend to live in chemically weird environments like deep sea methane seeps, places where methane is bubbling out of the seafloor, or deep sea hydrocarbon seeps. You know, we drill for a lot of oil in the Gulf of Mexico, and you know, every so often, you know, British Petroleum bleeps up, and we have an artificial spill into the Gulf of Mexico. But there are places where crude oil seeps into the Gulf and other parts of the world where it seeps in naturally. And where there's a permanent seep, there may be a whole ecosystem of strange critters that can actually metabolize those hydrocarbons. There are bacteria that can break those down, and you may find pogonophorans around there too. And then in 1977, the first time we started sending deep sea submersibles that could go down to hydrothermal rift vents, zones on the ocean floor where superheated water was coming out of the ocean bottom. Water that was extremely hot. In a few cases, it's actually past the critical point, which means it's so hot and also under such high pressure that the distinction between it being a liquid and it being a gas has kind of been forgotten. That happens when you're at sufficiently high temperature and pressure. So very strange habitats. And it turns out that around these hydrothermal rifts, there's an entire ecosystem of critters that are adapted to live there. And the base of their productivity is actually not the sun. It is highly specialized bacteria that can tolerate extremely hot temperatures and that can fix carbon using interesting chemical reactions. Some of you might know that we're thinking about trying to send probes to a moon of Jupiter called Ganymede and a moon of Saturn called Iapetus. And they're completely covered with an icy crust. But we're pretty sure that under that icy crust, if we can get through it, there's actually a zone of liquid water. I have no idea as to whether life could exist on either one of those, but if it does, in that ocean under that ice crust, if there's any life down there, it's probably like these deep sea hydrothermal rift life. This is the closest analog we can find to what life might look like on another body in our solar system. So anyway, there were giant worms found at these deep sea rifts. They started being discovered in 1977. They used to be considered, by some, they were called pogonophorans. For a time, they were put in a separate phylum called Vestimentifera. Now we recognize that they are weird polychaetes that go in this family Sibigliniidae. And that's what they look like. That's Riftia pachytyla at a hydrothermal vent. The yellowish stuff that you're seeing on the rocks is actually sulfur bacteria. They're able to generate energy by doing chemical reactions with hydrogen sulfide. The worms are in these white, thick tubes. You can see an empty tube over there on the left. And the worms are sticking out these great big tentacle beards. They're red because these worms use a form of hemoglobin, but they use it to pick up not oxygen, which there isn't much of down there. They use it to pick up hydrogen sulfide and transport it to the sulfur bacteria that they've got living inside their trophosomes. So they're completely dependent on sulfur bacteria. And yeah, it's the only ecosystem I know about that actually doesn't depend on the sun. If the sun were to disappear, life on the surface and almost everywhere would be gone in a matter of days, if not hours. But life at these hydrothermal vents might actually survive because it's warm enough to maintain liquid water, and there's a whole ecosystem of organisms that can survive there. There's another view. You can see again those beards of brilliant red tentacles that soak up hydrogen sulfide from the water. Notice there's a crab crawling around down there in about the center of the picture. There's a bunch of clams that can live down there. Bivalves, I think family Lucinidae. There are even some fish that can hang out there. Yeah, there is an entire ecosystem down there living off the energy and chemistry provided by those vents. And then that's a pogonophoran from not a hydrothermal vent, but a cold seep, where you have cold water that's rich in hydrocarbons and sulfide seeping from below. This is about 550 meters down in the Gulf of Mexico. This particular species actually has roots that grow through the sediment and take up sulfide and deliver it to the symbionts. Incidentally, the reason why some of those tubes are stained blue is I got this picture from a paper that was studying growth rates. And what they did was, I can't remember what they used, but they stained some of the tubes blue and then came back in 6 months and saw how much new growth they had been. As you see, it was quite a lot. These are very fast growers. But coming out of the tube, you can see those tentacle beards. And then Osidax was only discovered in 2002. That's a related worm, and it doesn't live around hydrothermal vents or cold seeps. It lives in bones. The deep ocean, the really deep ocean, is mostly pretty damn barren because, again, your only source of anything to eat is dead things raining down from above, and no, that's not very much. So much of the deep ocean doesn't actually have that much life. And what there is, as I've mentioned, is pretty low energy. You don't really have permanent deep sea fast attack predators. There's just not enough food for them. But when you have a dead whale, right? Whales live, whales die, as all things must. And dead whales, and sometimes dead, big fish or seals or things like that, when they die, they ultimately sink to the bottom. And the effect is kind of like opening up a Golden Corral buffet. All of a sudden, there is this enormous feast of food appearing in the middle of a complete desert. And there's entire communities of scavenger animals that grow up feeding on whale falls, as they're called, or fish falls, or in at least one experiment I remember reading about, alligator falls. Whenever a big ocean-going creature falls to the bottom of the deep sea. You get hagfish, you get ribbon worms, you get other types of fish, and you get Osidax, which can actually burrow into the bone. And this one's been removed from the bone. You can see the tentacles. That's the part that sticks out into the water. And then below that, you have these lumpy greenish things. That's a root system that grows through the bone and absorbs nutrients directly from the bone. Osidax is Latin for bone eater. And symbiotic bacteria in that root system do the work of absorbing bone nutrients. So that's weird. I love it. You could not make this stuff up. Again, there's no gut. And, they're not that easy to study. But, yeah, this is some of the cool things that cyboglynnid polychaetes can do. Okay, there's another former phylum called the Echyura. these so-called spoon worms, which always reminds me of the, was it Soundgarden? Did feel the rhythm in your hand, feel the rhythm while you can, spoon worm. Or was it Solicide? I can't remember now. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, frustrated heavy metal vocalist here. There's about 230 odd species. They're all marine. Typically, they burrow in soft sediments, and they used to be taken out of the annelids because the segmentation's been lost. Instead of a coelom divided up into septa, they've got this big unsegmented coelom that acts as a big hydrostat. If you go back to about lecture 3, and we were talking about hydrostatic skeletons in bilateria, echierans are beautiful examples of this. That, you know, if you squeeze one part of a water balloon, the other part will expand and extend. And a lot of organisms can use this as a means of organizing the body. Echierans do this very well. There is a proboscis. It's curved, and if you're on drugs, it looks like the bowl of a spoon. And there's very few chaetae that are left. The ones that are there are at the end of the body. Echiura means spiny tail. So-called because there's a few chaetae at the butt. And again, they used to be placed in a separate phylum, but they seem to lie within the annelids. They're annelids that have basically secondarily lost that segmentation. There's what a typical one of them looks like. You can see the bristles at the tail end and mucus on the proboscis, that spoon-shaped thing that's sticking out at the top. That's the head end. And mucus traps little food particles, and then cilia sweep that food down towards the mouth, which is down kind of at the base of the bowl of the spoon. There's no segmentation internally. You can see the gut there has been removed. It's mostly gut. You've got some gonads in the posterior. And this is why echierans used to be kept out of the annelids. But here's the thing. You also see loss of segmentation in true annelids that everybody agreed were annelids if they burrow in soft mud. This is Arenicola. I had a good friend in grad school who wanted to name her first daughter Arenicola because it sounds like a beautiful name. But unfortunately, it refers to a mud-burrowing segmented worm whose common name is the lugworm. So that's a lugworm right there. You can see the parapods there, the parapodia with the setae. They're reduced, but they're not absent the way they are in echierans. But this one has also lost much of its internal segmentation. And so having an open, unsegmented body may be an adaptation if you have to burrow in very soft mud. That's an echieran that's been taken out of its burrow and put in a glass tube so you can study its behavior. The common name for this one is innkeeper worm, because in the wild you can find small crabs, annelids, and even small fish that live in its burrow commensally. They don't seem to do it any harm. As far as I know, they don't benefit it much either. So it's a good example of commensal symbiosis. You can see that spoon-shaped proboscis up at the top, and surrounding it, you may be able to see this kind of filmy pinkish stuff. That's a mucus net. This thing blows a net of mucus sheets and uses that to filter water that it's pumping through the tube, traps particles on the mucus net, and then reels them into the mouth. There's another one with an extremely long spoon. Bonellia viridis is the green spoonworm. And if you were curious, it's not green because it has algal symbionts. It's green because it makes a unique green pigment. And And the weird thing about these dudes is that they have environmental sex determination. The females release eggs. The eggs hatch into trochophore larvae. The trochophore larvae swim around for a little bit and then settle to the bottom. And if they just settle to the bottom and don't touch anything, they'll develop into females. But a trochophore larva that touches the proboscis of a female develops into a male. And the males are extremely small. The males have pretty much lost all of their organs except for the testes. The males are basically just isolated testicles. And the males are parasitic. The males will crawl into the female's body cavity and take up residence in a part of her excretory organs, a specialized chamber called the androecium. Over there on the left, that's a female. You can see the proboscis gets very long. The proboscis can extend up to 2 meters. The males might only be 1 millimeter long, and a large female may have hundreds of millimeter long males living in her excretory system and, not working and just eating pizza and watching ESPN Sports Center all the time. I won't ask for personal details, but I'm certain that some of our female students may have had boyfriends that were kind of like that. But it's the way of things for Bonellia viridis. Right. One more old phylum that used to be in the polychaetes, Sipuncula. The common name for these guys is peanut worms. Maybe a few hundred species, mostly shallow marine, like to live in cracks in the rock or in old shells instead of burrowing like echierans do. They used to be placed in a separate phylum, but the molecular data seems to place them within the annelids again. So this is another group that was so unusual it used to have its own phylum. One person whose writings were influential when I was a junior woodchuck scientist pointed out once that a phylum used to be considered a statement of uncertainty. A phylum is what you established for organisms when you didn't know what they were most closely related to. If you had a group of organisms and you could tell, or you thought you could tell, what they were related to, you would group them with those. When your ability to group ran out was when you basically established a phylum. So there's nothing really magical about phyla, except phyla represent where we don't have solid evidence for relationships. But of course, this is kind of anachronistic because now, thanks to the molecular revolution and better cellular and anatomical studies, we do know how to group phyla together, or we think we do. So we've had to create ranks above there that don't really fit into the Linnaean classification scheme. So things like Bilateria, Protostomia, and Lophophorata, and Platyzoa, and Trochozoa, and Ecdysozoa. These things are in between kingdom and phylum, and we don't have a way of fitting them into the rank hierarchy. I've been calling them super duper phyla. But in fact, a lot of people now think that whole rank thing ought to be abolished because of its arbitrary nature. But that's a whole nother argument. Okay, Sipuncula, they're not segmented. The mouth's got a ring of tentacles around it. The tentacles are on an introvert, which again can be pulled inside out and retracted. The gut actually goes to the end of the body and then loops back, so the anus is on the side. There's a big coelom and no circulatory system. Here's what one of these looks like. You can see the mouth is at the right. The gut goes all the way down to the end and then loops back and twists around itself a bit and comes all the way back, and the anus opens just behind the mouth. You can see prominent retractor muscles that pull the introvert in. And that's what one of them looks like. The segmented thing is an unidentified polychaete, but you can see you have this kind of long, lumpy body that I guess could look like a peanut if you're on better drugs than I am. And the worm happens to have bent itself into a loop, but over on the left side, you can see the tentacles. They're partly extended. That introvert is not all the way out. There's one where the introvert is all the way out, and you can see the tentacles at one end. There's a kind of reddish lump over on the left-hand side, about a quarter of the way from the left margin. That's a calcified zone of skin called the anal shield. And yes, neat name. I'm not entirely sure I know what it does, but it is right next to the anus, and I suppose it shields the anus. Ooh, ah. Okay. That's actually a reasonably good spot to pause. So I'm going to stop recording for now. Has anybody got questions? I cannot be explaining this so well that everybody gets it. I ain't that good. Come on, there we go. Okay, I'm not seeing anything coming on the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, and I'll see you after the break.